Welcome to Ink and Insights, where we explore the thinkers and ideas shaping our world today. In this episode, we are joined by Colin Fisher. Colin is a professor, author, speaker, and occasional jazz trumpet player. He's the author of a book, The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups, published by Penguin Random House, USA, and Simon & Schuster, UK, which has been translated into 10 languages. His academic research on group dynamics, creativity, improvisation, and leadership has been published in the field's top academic journals. His work has been featured in prominent media outlets such as BBC, The Conversation, UK, The Daily Mail, Financial Times, Forbes, Fortune, Harvard Business Review, MSN, Next Big Idea Club, NPR, and Psychology Today. He is a sought-after keynote speaker for organizations around the world, including governments and Fortune 500 firms. Though he lives in Northeast London with his wife and two children, he can sometimes be found performing at jazz jams throughout London. In today's program, we'll delve deep into his book, The Collective Edge and Group Dynamism. Colin, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Shamir.
Thanks so much for having me, Sumit. Looking forward to it.
Let's begin by unpacking your book, Colin. The title of your book is The Collective Edge. What does collective edge mean to you?
A collective edge is really about seeing the world through the lens of groups and collectives that we're all a part of that are influencing our lives. That so much of the way most people see the world, and especially in this kind of self-help and management genre, the way they think of developing themselves and their careers are fundamentally individualistic. That we think about, how can I become a better person? How can I become a better leader? And that, at the kind of very end of a lot of these books, there's a little part that also says, and you should join a group that helps you, think about this. And so I want to flip that around and ask people to say, what if we thought of the group as the primary driver of our success at work and in life and in the world? And if we try and understand, everything from what's happening at our dinner table to what's happening in politics and in the world and at work through this lens of groups, then that's going to give us an advantage. That's going to give us this edge. And that moreover, the factors that lead to effective groups are often really misunderstood. So the edge is both seeing the world through this lens of groups and then knowing which parts of groups really matter for having happier, healthier, and more effective groups and teams.
Right. Colin, was there a moment in your career when you realized that group dynamics were more powerful than individual brilliance?
I think really my fascination with groups began as during my career as a jazz trumpet player, and that as jazz musicians, we often play in these jam sessions with people who we've never met, who we may not have spoken to, and that I was really interested about the times where you would get together with a group of people and I would play, and maybe we didn't speak the same language, but that things could just click and we could play something that no one of us possibly could have thought of. Things that I wasn't practicing on my own when I was, working in the practice room. Mm-hmm. And I really started to get fascinated with this influence that the group as a whole seemed to have. That, you could even play with some of the same people in another group and it wouldn't happen again. So it seemed like there was something special about certain groups of people, certain conditions, and it seemed like there must be some way to really understand this. So I think those were really what got me into thinking about groups.
Right. And what unseen forces, shape how groups succeed or fail?
The things that we tend to overlook and that really are unseen are the goals that the group has, and how the extent to which we really share an understanding of what those goals are and what they mean, the tasks that we're trying to do together, the social norms, the kind of way that we interact, whether it's okay to speak up and ask questions, whether we joke around a lot, whether everyone contributes or one person tends to dominate, and then something that's a little more seen but we tend to overlook, which is just the composition of the group. Who's in the group, and that the part we tend to overlook the most is how many people are in the group. And that if I have to guess what's going wrong in any organization, it's usually you're trying to have meetings with too many people at the same time, that our groups tend to be too big that we try and collaborate with. So these are some of the main ones. And then when we kind of get to the second level of unseen forces, we get into something that's become more and more well known, which is psychological safety. The idea that it's safe to speak up in a group, to express our opinion, to speak against the status quo, make mistakes, and take these kind of interpersonal risks that might otherwise embarrass us. And the groups where we feel like it's safe to do those things tend to be more effective than others. And then groups that are getting outside help and coaching and actually reaching outside their boundaries. And that these 6 things are really what I talk about in the book as being the foundation of effective teams that we've found through the past few decades of research.
Right. And how fragile is a trust in a team, and how can it be rebuilt?
Yeah, so I mean, psychological safety is a form of trust, and that and honestly, it's the most important form of it. But I'll kind of back up and talk about trust more generally. So, trust is definitely fragile. But there's kind of 2 different kinds of trust that people tend to get confused when they think about groups and teams. That one is what we would call socio-emotional trust. The trust that you have my best interests at heart, that I can tell you my deepest, darkest secrets, and you're not going to betray me. And that's the kind of trust we tend to have with friends and family, the people that we're more emotionally close to. But then there's also trust, meaning when you tell me you're going to do something, I believe you, and that I believe that you're going to do it to a standard that helps me. And those are the kinds of what we would call instrumental or work-based trust that we have with our colleagues at work. When I say, hey, Sumit, can you send me this document tomorrow? I believe you're going to do it, and I believe that you're going to do it to a good standard. Now, I think where people get into trouble about thinking about trust in groups is that they think of these 2 types of trust as completely interchangeable. But that we know there's plenty of our family and friends who we wouldn't want to work with on a team, who we can't rely on to do these kind of work-based trust activities. And this kind of feeds into how people think about team building, where they try to get together and they do trust falls and they tell each other their personal narratives. And that's not a bad thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily build this work-based trust. And that's the kind of trust that if we're really talking about being in a workplace, being in a team, being in these kind of high-stakes decision-making environments, we need that kind of trust too. And the way that we build each of them isn't the same. So trust is definitely fragile in the sense that it's easy to break, and that just like everything else in our psychology, when something bad happens, these negative events, they stick with our memories. We remember them more vividly than we do positive events. And so it takes more to overcome any kind of breach of trust than it does to build it in the first place. But it's also important, and the more common mistake, I think, is to not be investing in building the right kind of trust for your group. And that thinking that just because we build one kind of trust, the other kind of trust will naturally emerge.
Right. And also, I think conflict also looks pretty inevitable in a group dynamism. But can that conflict actually be the secret ingredient to innovation?
Absolutely. So conflict, again, comes in these same 2 flavors, that we can have conflict that's about the work itself. We can disagree about what decision to make. We can have different ideas that we want to pursue. that kind of disagreement is good. In fact, it's the reason that we often have groups, is that we're going to have these combinations of different perspectives, different expertise, and bring them together into one thing, right? And for a lot of groups, especially if we're talking about making decisions or coming up with innovative or creative ideas, if everyone thinks the same thing, there's not that much reason to have the group in the first place. Right. So we definitely want that disagreement about the task. But when we start, actively disliking one another, when we start, attributing problems we're having to the type of person that someone is. So when we start saying things like, "Oh, you're the kind of person who always does such and such," that kind of conflict is always bad for groups. And that when we have this relationship-based conflict, that's a very difficult thing for groups to kind of recover from and put back in the box. So I encourage managers to have a zero tolerance policy for relationship conflict, where anytime it's starting to emerge, you take a break, you try to calm down, you try to switch the way we're talking to one another, so that we're saying it's us against the problem, not it's you against me. But we want to encourage that disagreement about what should we do next? What ideas do we have? How can we attack this problem? That kind of disagreement is quite good, and that is where innovation comes from.
Right. Have you seen unexpected individuals becoming catalyst for change?
Definitely. Although I think this gets into the idea of I'm hesitant to fully attribute what's happening in the group to single members very often. That I would like us for the most part to try and think about, can we create a climate where somebody can make an unexpected comment? And this comes back to that idea of psychological safety, that in a very psychologically safe group, we should be able to see that. We should be able to have people saying stuff that surprises us, taking these kinds of making suggestions and interpersonal risks, or people who don't usually speak up, speaking up. That should be what's happening in these groups. And so, yeah, absolutely, we should see this coming from sources we don't expect. Because again, if you're in a group and you can predict what everyone's going to say all the time, you're probably not in the most effective group. Like, you should be surprised when we get together at a meeting and say, "Oh, what do you think? What are we coming up with?" Just like these jazz groups where it's like something comes out of you that you didn't expect, that you didn't know was there. The great groups are bringing those things out of everybody. So we should have those moments of surprise in any really, really healthy group.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है, बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल, नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु।
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको, 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो। के भो? अचम्म छ। एक्सक्युज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन?
गेट आउट।
हेलो,
के सोच्यौ त?
के सोच्ने? मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके। 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस। साउजी, एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा के हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर, एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआईसी नेपाल।
And how does emotion, spread through a group, and how can leaders steer it?
Yeah, I mean, we're very sensitive to other people's emotions. That as social creatures, we evolve to be able to detect the emotions of other people and the people who we view ourselves as being one with, identifying with, being a part of a group with. We're going to pick up even more cues from those people. So we're always going to be looking around and trying to not even trying to, but we're going to detect the emotions that others have. When our fellow group members are upset, we're going to feel that more acutely. When they're happy or excited, we're going to feel that as well. So we really don't have to do anything for these emotions to spread, but that formal leadership positions, we're also creatures that have some hierarchical tendencies in the way we see the world, and that we do tend to look to, formal leaders, to, people we respect, and those people have more of an influence on how a group is going. And
Right.
so if you are a leader, your emotions are going to have a disproportionate effect on the group. And so certainly managing yourself is part of it. But I think, we sometimes get too caught up into these kind of implicit parts of leadership and social influence, and that the leaders I see who are most effective are actually quite explicit. They say the quiet part that everyone else just assumes out loud. And so you're saying like, hey, even if I'm having a big day, like this is an exciting opportunity we have, let's dig into this. Or I really want us to, share our excitement and our enthusiasm for this. But I also want, when you're worried or concerned, that you're able to come to me and we can talk about it. We can have conversations that are going to kind of, manage and contain different kinds of emotions or harvest them by simply saying, these pieces of information are things that we should be using and we should be talking about, and that we're not going to let them, kind of run wild by pretending like they don't exist as we're going through the group.
Right. Colin, you might have, definitely mentioned this in your book. What causes, high-performing teams to lose their edge?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think most, organizations kind of have this theory that, if you have a really high-performing group, eventually things are going to kind of get stale and the group's performance is going to fall off. And that, certainly we see that in, popular team contexts like sports or something where, it's hard to stay on top very long. But the evidence on this is actually quite surprising, that groups that stay together longer tend to keep performing better. And that trend stays for a very long time, that it's often not until years into being together that we start to see some evidence that maybe groups, especially those doing creative or innovative work, might see a little bit of a decline, often 4 or 5 years into a group working together. But this isn't how most organizations run. Most organizations are breaking up project teams all the time and kind of mixing things up. And the evidence suggests that's not a great strategy. That when we have a group that's really performing well, they're probably going to keep performing well into the future. We certainly see times like in famous, bands like the Beatles or in, sports teams where individual egos can get in the way in these kind of high profile, very media exposed kind of contexts. But most of us aren't working in those contexts. And if we do, again, continue to have honest conversations about what people need from the group, where they have room to grow, what they want to do, that we can fend these things off. But also where, I think a lot of these groups where this happens, there's this expectation that groups are going to get all of their needs met, or individuals are going to get all of their needs met just by this one group. So, I talk about kind of these one-hit wonder bands where they break down in because of these conflict about who's getting the most credit and who gets to have the most influence on artistic direction. But that successful bands who stayed together for decades, like the Rolling Stones, although, they have their problems, they were very easygoing about members having other projects. And so you didn't need to get all your needs met through just this one group. that if you want to, go do your own thing, you have other options than just, turning to the same place over and over. And I think we do have, all of us are members of lots of different kinds of groups. We have lots of different kinds of needs, and that it's actually not that healthy to try and get all those needs met just by this one group all the time.
Right. So there has to have some sort of flexibility wherein people can move around and kind of, capitalize on their needs based on different groups.
Yeah, exactly. That, if you want, your work team to also be your best friends and also be your creative outlet and to do all these things, those kind of insular groups that only look inward, those are the ones that tend to have the problems, that become more cult-like, that have problems like groupthink, that have this conflict because people want too many different things from the same group. Right. Whereas people who, they've got their family, they've got their friends, they've got their work teams, and they have, sometimes multiple different projects and work teams. Those are the kind of systems for you as an individual that are more likely to have you get what you need from groups, rather than saying, I need everything just from this one group of people.
Right. How do you scale group dynamism from small teams to entire organizations?
I mean, organizations are inherently groups of groups, right? Like any organization is just a bunch of nested groups and teams within each other. And so in a way, if we're thinking, I'm going from scaling up from like a startup and I have a core team of a handful of people to a big organization, what you're doing is not just adding individuals, but you're adding teams. And that you, if you're really conscious, again, and this gets back to the idea of a collective edge and seeing the world through this more group-based lens, if you don't see it as, oh, I'm just adding this one person, to say, well, have I now gotten too big for us to operate as one team? And we actually need to split up into 2, 3, 4 different teams. Then we can really, manage effectively the scaling process. And this is where I think almost everyone kind of goes wrong, is that they underestimate how hard it is to coordinate when you keep adding people to a group one at a time and keep trying to work the same way you used to work. That what we find in research is that, people are most satisfied and most able to kind of, have productive conversations when groups are 4 or 5 members large. It's kind of 4.5 is the optimal group size. But that anything over about 7, we start to have coordination problems. And so once you have, what you think of as your team is, 10, 11, 12 people, you probably need to start splitting things up into smaller groups, at least for large chunks of your work. And that the same thing keeps happening. As soon as you start to get over this number of 3 to 7 members who are trying to be in a room, doing work together, being interdependent, making decisions, that you need to think about splitting things up in some ways. And that is the scaling process on some level, is to realizing, oh, we can't actually hear everyone's perspective anymore. Like we can all be in the room together, but I'm not going to get the benefit of your expertise if there's 20 of us gathered in a room for a 1-hour meeting. Like we're just not going to meaningfully learn what a lot of people think, no matter what else we do. And so this kind of scaling process is, in essence, a splitting process of saying, all right, now we've got to manage not one, like we're one group, we've got to manage this like we're 2 groups, like we're 3 groups, like we're 4 groups. And that we have to define the interdependence between those different groups and sort of have ways that we're sharing information in between them. And again, making them not too inward facing, but that is essentially how we scale any organization.
Right. And in your experience, how are digital tools reshaping collaboration compared to face-to-face?
I mean, all of us, clearly are in a digital world, we're all familiar with, this kind of video conferencing, across the world like we're doing right now, which, has already reshaped things in a way that we take for granted. But, we've sort of lost a few key components that we're used to when we're face to face. The things like our ability to detect one another's emotion through nonverbal cues and body language and things like this. They're not as good over these virtual channels. And so we have to try harder. And again, leaders play a key role by making this explicit and saying, hey, if we're going to have these virtual meetings, I want to make sure we take some time to check in, find out how everyone's doing, to substitute for that kind of hallway informal conversation that we used to have.
Right.
And, there are creative ways to do that depending on what you're comfortable with. But we do have to make more of an effort to humanize one another when we're over these virtual channels. I think we're the new world in which I get asked about how AI is reshaping teams and collaboration a lot now. And I think, there's not one answer to that question, because what AI even means is in flux, and it means it can play a lot of different roles for a lot of different people. The problem I see teams having with it is that people aren't honest about what they're using it for.
Right.
Because they're in a lot of countries and in a lot of workplaces, there's still some stigma about what it's okay to use it for and what it's not okay to use it for. But that we're not always talking about that explicitly. We're not saying to our teammates, hey, here's the way I'm using this tool as part of my work for this team. Does that seem okay to you? Is that affecting you in a negative way? Are there things you're doing that are better than that? And because we're not having those conversations, we're learning slower. And that we sometimes, at the worst case scenario, we end up with situations where, one team member is sending AI written emails to another team member who's having AI read that email and respond to it. And, we just have a bunch of AIs talking to each other, not doing any real work, right? At the kind of worst case scenario. And so I think the thing that I think will help most people is to, have real conversations about it and say, hey, how are people using this in our work? What do we think of that? Is that causing, is the way that I'm using AI causing problems for you in your work? Most of us don't want that. Can we stop that? And can we find a better way to do it? And I think once we're having those conversations, we're going to start to see, kind of a more effective reshaping of collaboration in a lot of organizations.
Absolutely, Colin. Otherwise, machine would be responding to machine, and there would be no people in between, right? So,
yeah.
So my last question for today's program, Colin, is there a paradox where pursuing collective edge actually hinders it?
I mean, there's so many paradoxes in group life that I think are fascinating, that all, pursuing group effectiveness is always a little bit in tension with individuals' interests beyond that group, right? That, like, if we imagine a group that, again, is demanding more and more of our attention and having us prioritize the collective over individual needs, that group will eventually, basically eat up the individual's needs. So if we think of like ants and insects that work in collective hive kind of superorganisms, as E.O. Wilson calls them, they're very successful as a group, but they always will sacrifice the individual for the collective needs. And that as humans, this is why, I think a lot of people disagree with E.O. Wilson that human beings are superorganisms, because we don't want a world where our groups prioritize the collective over the individual. That it's always this balancing act, and that there's always going to be times where the two are in tension. And the superpower that we have to manage that paradox and that tension is the ability to communicate and reason with each other and come up with creative solutions to how we can live and work together in new ways that we haven't thought of yet. And I think this is a paradox that we're managing every single day, that by it doesn't go away. And that, it keeps me employed, it keeps me in business, because no matter, even if you do everything right, you can't stop thinking about and managing and leading your groups, because as individuals, our lives are happening outside of this group that kind of messes with the alignment between how we think about the goals we have, how we think about our norms, and how we interact. The world is changing around us, and we can't just assume that the environment we're working on today is the same as yesterday, and that our needs outside, what's happening in my home life, what's happening in my other groups, if I'm busier, if I'm not as busy, if I'm going on holiday, these things are always in flux. And so we're constantly having to do this work of coordinating and aligning what the collective needs and what the individuals who make up that collective need. It is a paradox that we manage rather than a problem that we solve and then it goes away, which means, like I said, you can reread the book over and over and over, and it'll still be relevant tomorrow and remind you of a few things you probably need to do that you hadn't thought of. It still does that for me, even though I wrote it and I talk about it. I still need these reminders of how do we keep our groups healthy and how do we sort of keep them on track in both satisfying their own needs, but also serving the individuals who make them up.
Right. So would I be correct to sum up by saying that the collectivism and the individualism need to be calibrated for a healthy organization as well as for a healthy society?
Absolutely. One of the things that stunned me in doing this work is research on looking at individualism in society broadly. And that every indicator of individualism, whether it's the amount of time we spend alone, whether it's rates of living alone, whether it's just people's beliefs about how individualistic we are, and even my personal favorite, the uniqueness of the baby names we give our children, all those things have been on the rise for over 100 years. And that we are now living in the most individualistic time to have ever been a human being. And I think one of the reasons that I've written this book now and that I think people have been interested in it is that I think people are feeling like the pendulum has gone a little too far. That society has gotten so individualistic that we need to balance it out with a reminder of how we're interdependent, how we need each other, and the importance of collaborating and living and working in groups in ways that are productive and helpful.
Thank you so much, Colin. On that note, I'd really like to appreciate the time that you have given to my platform. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Sumit.